In 2005, a couple named Sarah and Michael Thompson mysteriously vanished while camping in Yellowstone National Park. Sarah was pregnant with their first child, and they had gone there to celebrate the happy news. After their disappearance, search and rescue teams tried to find them for several months, but the search was unsuccessful. Hope of finding them alive gradually faded, and the case was considered one of the most tragic disappearances in the park's history. 11 years later, in 2016, a hiker discovered skeletal remains in a remote area of Yellowstone National Park. The skeleton was wearing a knitted sweater and blue jeans, clothing similar to what Michael Thompson wore on the day he disappeared. DNA testing confirmed that the remains were Michael Thompson's. However, what makes this story even more mysterious is that no trace of Sarah or her clothing was found at the scene. To this day, authorities still cannot explain what exactly happened to Michael and Sarah Thompson. The case remains an unsolved mystery, leaving many questions for their family and friends. 2 years after Michael's remains were identified, the case had gone cold again. The absence of any evidence related to Sarah or their unborn child baffled investigators and tormented their families. The official file was marked as an open but inactive missing persons case. However, the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Yellowstone still held a secret. A dedicated volunteer, an elderly man named George who spent his retirement hiking and documenting the park's lesser-known trails, stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried under a fallen log in a completely different sector of the park, nearly 5 miles from where Michael's skeleton was found, he discovered a mud-caked backpack. Inside the weathered pack, George found a woman's jacket, a water bottle, and a small, damaged digital camera. The camera's casing was cracked and its battery was dead. But George, a retired electronics engineer, had a feeling about it. He carefully extracted the memory card and, using specialized equipment, managed to recover a single image. The photo was the last one taken on the camera. It was a blurry, grainy shot of a scenic valley, but in the lower right corner, just barely visible, was a detail that sent a shiver down his spine. It showed the back of a figure dressed in dark clothing, walking away from the camera and toward the dense forest. The figure was not Michael. This single piece of evidence completely changed the nature of the investigation. The fact that the backpack was found so far from Michael's remains, and that the final photo depicted an unidentified person, suggested a more sinister plot. Was this an accidental encounter gone wrong or something more premeditated? The search for Sarah and her baby was no longer just a missing persons case. It was now a potential homicide inquiry with a new unknown person of interest. Investigators from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit were called in. The blurry photo, though frustratingly low quality, was their only new lead. After weeks of using advanced facial recognition software and cross-referencing with park ranger, logs, and criminal databases, they came up with a potential match: an off-grid survivalist known as Silas Vance. He was known to live deep in the Yellowstone wilderness, a phantom presence that occasionally crossed paths with hikers or rangers. When they finally located him, Silas was exactly where they'd been told he'd be. Weathered man with a thick beard and wary eyes. He was initially silent and uncooperative, but after hours of questioning and being shown the photo, he finally spoke. "I saw them," he rasped, his voice hoarse from years of little use. "I saw them with him." Silas wasn't the culprit. He was a terrified witness. He described how he had been watching the Thompsons from a distance, as he often did with campers. He saw a man in a black jacket and jeans, a figure who didn't fit with the Thompsons' camping gear or demeanor, approach their campsite. The man appeared to be arguing with Michael, but Sarah stepped between them, her pregnant belly prominent. Silas watched as the argument escalated. He then saw the man in black force Michael to leave the site and follow him into the woods. He saw Sarah, looking distressed and distraught, grab her backpack and follow them. A few minutes later, Silas, who had learned to avoid human conflict at all costs, went in the opposite direction, but he heard a scream in the distance. He hadn't reported it, fearing getting involved. Based on Silas's detailed description, the FBI was able to create a sketch of the man. The sketch, when cross-referenced with Michael's personal records, pointed to a horrifying possibility. The man was Mark Hansen, a former business partner of Michael's, who had threatened to ruin him after a failed business venture years prior. The mystery was no longer a tragic accident but a calculated crime. The authorities now had a prime suspect and a motive. They had a name and a face to connect to Michael's death. But with Mark Hansen's whereabouts unknown and Sarah and the baby still missing, the dark truth of what happened in Yellowstone remained elusive. The hunt for Mark Hansen began immediately, but with every passing day, the hope of finding Sarah alive faded further into the deep, unforgiving wilderness. The manhunt for Mark Hansen was swift and coordinated. Based on the sketch and Michael's financial records, the FBI learned that Mark had a history of spending time in the wilderness and was an experienced hiker. They theorized he might be hiding in a remote cabin or shelter within the vast park. After 2 days of intense searching, they found him. He wasn't hiding in a cabin, but was found at the bottom of a ravine, his leg shattered from a fall. He was weak and delirious but alive. Taken into custody and given medical treatment, Mark finally broke down and confessed everything. He admitted to following Michael to Yellowstone, with the sole purpose of confronting him about the business deal that had financially ruined him. He planned to threaten him, scare him, but not to kill him. When he approached the campsite, he saw Michael and Sarah, and the sight of her pregnant belly filled him with a rage he hadn't anticipated. He confronted Michael, and their argument quickly became a physical fight. In a moment of panic, Mark pushed Michael, who stumbled and fell, hitting his head on a rock. Mark fled, believing he had killed him, and hid in the wilderness. He never saw Sarah again. The case was officially closed for Michael Thompson. Mark Hansen was charged with manslaughter, not murder, as his actions were deemed a reckless accident. However, Mark's confession only solved half the mystery. Sarah and her baby were still gone. The authorities and her family now had to face a new, more tragic truth. Sarah had not been a victim of a crime, but a victim of the wilderness. Traumatized and alone after witnessing her husband's death, she had likely fled in a state of panic, disoriented and without a clear plan. With no survival gear, no knowledge of the treacherous terrain, and her pregnant state, the chances of her survival were non-existent. The case of the Thompsons, once a haunting criminal mystery, had come to a sorrowful end. It was no longer about a malicious act, but about the brutal, unforgiving nature of both human rage and the wild. Her remains were never found, but her story was finally told, a heartbreaking tale of a young family whose dreams were shattered by a moment of violence and an escape into an unforgiving forest. Years passed. The case of the Thompson family was closed, a somber footnote in the park's history. Mark Hansen was serving his sentence, a living testament to a moment of rage that had spiraled into a double tragedy. The family of Michael and Sarah found a fragile sense of closure, but for Sarah's sister Emily, the vast, silent wilderness of Yellowstone still held a haunting grip on her heart. A decade after the events, Emily returned to the park. She no longer came seeking answers but to say a final goodbye. She hiked for days, navigating the same treacherous trails that had swallowed her sister, and found herself in a quiet, secluded meadow far from any path. It was a place she felt in her bones might have been one of Sarah's last stops. As she sat on a fallen log, taking in the peaceful scene, a glint of metal caught her eye. Partially buried in the moss at the base of a towering pine tree was a small, tarnished locket. Emily's breath hitched. She recognized it immediately. It was a locket Sarah had worn every day, a gift from Michael on their first anniversary. Inside, the locket held two tiny, faded photos, one of Michael's smiling face, the other of Sarah's, radiant with a quiet happiness. Beneath the pictures, barely legible, was an engraving on the silver, "Our Forever." Emily held the locket, its cold weight a painful comfort. It was a final, silent message from a woman who had fought for her life and her unborn child in the unforgiving wild. It wasn't the heroic ending they had hoped for, but it was an ending all the same. The mystery was gone, replaced by a profound and sorrowful understanding. The wilderness had taken Sarah, but it had left a small, beautiful reminder of the love story that had led her there. Emily reburied the locket at the base of the tree. It was the only grave Sarah would ever have, a final resting place not marked by stone, but by the quiet memory of a love that, for one brief and beautiful moment, had felt like it could last forever. The story of Michael and Sarah Thompson has reached its conclusion. With Emily's discovery of the locket and the final confession of Mark Hansen, the mystery has been fully resolved, bringing a somber but complete end to their tragic tale. The narrative began as a simple missing persons case, evolved into a criminal investigation with the discovery of Michael's remains, and finally ended as a human tragedy with the understanding of Sarah's fate in the unforgiving wilderness. The locket served as the final poignant piece of evidence, providing a sense of closure for the family that no official report could.